Composed, unadorned, often frugal, Lahiri's prose is an unlikely heir to the verbal exuberance, formal self-referentiality, and generic plurality we might typically associate with postmodern writing. But even if the affinity here isn't exactly formal, it's more legitimately thematic, as Lahiri zeroes in on the very ontology of transnational experience. Engaging with the most intimate repercussions of cultural mobility, she tracks migrant lives into localized situations to perform, in turn, a worlding of actions and decisions that coalesce there. Minor affairs, to borrow Philip Hensher's phrase, take on an unexpected kind of scale. And it's precisely this prismatic refraction of prosaic events that also takes centre stage in the recent work of Zadie Smith. Despite her reputation as being emblematic of a new wave of multicultural British fiction, Smith's work has, in other respects, felt distinctly sectoral, so to speak, fascinated by the day-to-day dramas of very specific suburban districts. While set on opposite sides of the pond, White Teeth in 2000 and On Beauty 2005 work from ordinary domestic spheres outward. Both exhibit Smith's militant particularism, as David Harvey might label it, an interest in local spaces as sites for the struggle toward an unromanticised, yet for that reason potentially durable, cosmopolitan vision. This emphasis on the regionally specific sort of micro-sociology of the everyday city continues in NW. Even the cloth cover, the cover of the hardback edition, was intended, according to its designer John Gray, to look very English and particularly representative of London. Judge for yourself, I guess. But NW's jazzy jacket is maybe bold, simple, and eye-catching, as Gray had hoped. But the first pages give a taste of a narrative that certainly catches the eye, but is not always simple to follow. The plot opens in what might first look like an uneventful domestic scene as the volatile Shah pleads for help at the Wilson doorstep of the 30-something Leah Hanwell. The emergency, a quick cash loan for Shah to catch a taxi to see her supposedly hospitalised mother, turns out to be a scam, costing Leah 30 quid, but entwining the two women for the rest of the novel. In the following section, we move through Soho to chart the fate of an endearing recovering addict, the Caribbean Felix Cooper, as he bids farewell to a former lover. After reprimanding two black youths on the Underground for failing to give up their seat for a white pregnant woman, Felix is briefly taunted and fatally stabbed, becoming a victim of violence that's not racial exactly on this occasion, but fiercely casual. We then switch perspectives again to what is the novel's longest part, Host, whose numbered and thematized sections implicitly salute Joyce's A-list chapter from Ulysses. These vignettes recount the experience of Leah's Jamaican friend, Natalie, formerly Keisha, all the way from borrowing her first Walkman to her present habit of indulging in anonymous internet sex. Like something of an epilogue, the final section, Visitation, ties these threads together in a closing scene of reunion. Leah is reconciled with her French-Algerian partner Michel while rejoining Natalie to untangle the chain of criminal deceptions. Summaries like this, though, aren't really helpful in Smith's world, in her sort of fictions of worldly localisms. That's because beneath her verbal razzmatazz, her fictions offer everyday domains of unexpected profundity, where the seemingly pedestrian movement from one action to the next is of secondary importance to the perspectival narration of significant sensory or spatial details illuminated along the way. NW's reader is compelled to find, therefore, interest less in the connective sinew between events than in the punctilious yet oblique manner of their description. Now, the ethical implications of this obliquity, though, aren't of the Jamesian kind, generated by the partiality of a central focalizing consciousness. They have more to do with Smith's accretive presentation of scenes that unfold through a curious way of combining direct speech, cued only with a Joycean dash in the opening section, interior thoughts conveyed by free and direct style, and the sudden intrusion of a gnomic narratorial voice stepping in to extract maxims from the mundane. Consider Leah's hurried farewell to Shah, oblivious of her ruse, as Michelle arrives home from work too late to correct Leah's naivety, and it's the first long quote from NW on your handout. Who that? Michelle, my husband. Girl's name? French. Nice looking, innit? Nice looking babies. Shah winks, a grotesque compression at one side of her face. Shah drops her cigarette and gets in the car, leaving the door open. The money remains in Leah's hand. He local, seen him about. He works in the hairdressers by the station. From Marseille, he's French, been here forever. African though. Originally, look, do you want me to come with you? Shah says nothing for a moment, then steps out of the car and reaches up to Leah's face with both hands. You're a really good person. I was meant to come to your door. Seriously, you're a spiritual person. There's something spiritual inside you. Leah grips Shah's hand tight and submits to a kiss. Shah's mouth is slightly open on Leah's cheek for a thank, now closes with you. In reply, Leah says something she has never said in her life. God bless you. They part. Shah backs away awkwardly and turns toward the car, almost gone. Leah presses the money into Shah's hand with defiance. But already the grandeur of the experience threatens to flatten the conventional into anecdote. Only £30, only an ill mother, neither a murder nor a rape. Nothing survives its telling. The sequence exemplifies, I think, the sort of two-tiered fashion in which Smith moves from direct speech, barely represented here in repertorial fashion, to a third-person reflections of a more conspicuously abstract kind. A certain duality lies behind her aim, therefore. On the one hand, to simulate quick-fire conversations in all their unadorned immediacy, and on the other, to linger over the miniature profundities that such conversations reveal. One could say that Smith tries to make too much of the hidden ethical potential of such moments of interracial encounter. One could also say that she frames quite deliberately what David Marcus, as we heard earlier, called those rare, fragile moments of contact we find in a new generation of writers like Smith and Dave Eggers and so on. But even as such moments do seem deliberate, Smith is careful here not to sentimentalise these encounters. As with the frugality of Lahiri's short stories, so here in NW, the tautness of Smith's syntax offers a kind of grammatical correlative to the self-restraint she exercises in emotive episodes across the novel, episodes that could have easily been rhetorically embellished to emphasise their poignancy. Nonetheless, Smith has no hesitation here in departing from Leah's perspective to intrude as an observer of delicate gravities. Leah probably won't have been ruminating on how, quote, the grandeur of experience threatens to flatten into the conventional, or on the extent to which this unanticipated moment of reciprocity is prone to anecdote. We might be reminded of Middlemarch's sometimes teacherly commentator, a narrator who ensures that in socially awkward exchanges, the underlying ethical subtleties are rarely lost on Eliot's readers, even if they're missed by the characters involved. As for Eliot, so for Smith, there's nothing immoral about speaking for one's fictional agents. But it's revealing that Smith still wants the license, if you like, to riff on the implications of how tenderness between persons across racial and economic divides can be fleetingly glimpsed, how that tenderness can be replaced just as fleetingly disappointment, and ultimately to show how even the most earnest individuals, like Leah, must watch out for their own tendency to regard inconsequential moments like this as microcosms of virtue. Smith, of course, has spent a number of years pondering the challenge of retooling the ethical job of fiction in an age after postmodernism. Thus, the complicated connection is seen here between showing and telling, between impartially rendering and conspicuously imposing, between contriving a scenario of contact across race and class and then signposting this scenario's ethical lessons. Now, these complications show how alert Smith is, in Dorothy Hale's terms, to how, quote, the perspectivalism that grounds the aesthetics of alterity also causes problems for its perfect realisation. Smith foregrounds for her readers that process of realisation, making no attempt to muffle an intrusive and instructive narratorial voice, yet without detracting from the essential ethical dilemmas that are themselves dramatically foregrounded for her characters in these brief encounters. Smith's multiracial imaginary, then, is at once unsentimental and vigilant. To that extent, NW suggests that what's more significant the overt staging of cosmopolitanism, as Janet Lyon observes, is the role that cosmopolitan fragility plays in the conditional sense of worldly engagement. That fragile terrain of social and ethnic conviviality is reciprocated on a more individualised level in NW's penultimate section, Crossing, where a desperate and forlorn Natalie walks to Hornsey Lane Bridge, a site infamous for suicides. She takes in the elevated prospect of London's financial heart. Though lofty, the perspective isn't sublimely panoramic. Instead of encompassing all she surveys, her view of the city is splintered at eye level with the bridge's intricate iron lattices. At this point, Smith is careful not to offer, as she might have done earlier in her career, I think, an aphoristic gloss on the way Natalie's proliferating images of the topography below links by analogy to the city's irrepressible diversity. We're instead privy to what Natalie sees in a jumbled and unsynthesized manner. In turn, Smith initially refuses the luxury of imposing as the wise sage with a proverb to hand, one that would help to reassemble the worldlier implications of a scene currently scattered by a view that's cross-hatched. And this is the second quote on the handout. St. Paul's in one box, the Gherkin in another, half a tree, half a car, cupolas, spires, squares, rectangles, half moons, stars. It was impossible to get any sense of the whole. From up here, the bus lane was a red gash through the city. The tower blocks were the only things she could see that made any sense, separated from each other, yet communicating. From this distance, they had a logic, stone posts driven into an ancient field, waiting for something to be laid on top of them, a statue perhaps, or a platform. A man and a woman walked over and stood next to Natalie at the railing. "Beautiful view," said the woman. She had a French accent. She didn't sound at all convinced by what she'd said. After a minute, the couple walked back down the hill. The catalogue of trees, cars, spires and squares firmly lines up the discourse with Natalie's perspective. In turn, the language responds to this alignment as Smith's choppy syntax bluntly eschews the impulse to spread a sweet, lyrical glaze over the view of ordinary sights. Eschewed as well are those aphoristic asides, those pathos-hungry elaborations that the Zadie Smith of On Beauty would have surely employed to make much of Natalie's incapacity, quote, to get any sense of the whole. As such, the scene is allowed to stand on its own right, to signify in its own potentially profound and potentially inconsequential terms. This is something of a new ethical manoeuvre on Smith's part, one that not only affirms the perspectivism upon which the aesthetics of alterity rests in fiction, but also that highlights how Smith's deliberate quelling of authorial evaluation might itself be ethically motivated. Gradually opting for a more distant voice then in NW, Smith's impersonality seems all the more virtuous for being so purposeful. But her mark as a commentator on cosmopolitan fragility is detectable here nonetheless. In the passage, for instance, that the two tower blocks can be seen tacitly communicating with each other is an insight supposedly grasped by a woman contemplating suicide, or at least contemplating her proximity to the tragic history of suicides the bridge memorialises. It's not that this insight isn't entirely credible, so much as its provenance feels subtly divided, as though the narrator is assisting Natalie with the job of defamiliarising a multicultural realm that appears opaque, pointing the way to some hidden logic hidden behind the grey facade of urban sprawl. More evidence of Smith's orchestration quickly follows, when the ambivalently beautiful view is confirmed by a Frenchwoman who, like the high-rises, appears both separate from Natalie, yet in communication with her. We cannot tell whether she's speaking suddenly about nowhere to Natalie or simply to her partner. Well, who cares about such minuscule ambiguities within this localised scene? Well, Zadie Smith does, and she wants us to care too, for the worldly ramifications of her localised forms of attention become plain in scenes such as this, where Smith creates a web of reverberating images and sentiments that enlace, much like the cross-hatched lattice work of that bridge, to create an existential logic that's not merely suggestive, but as it turns out for Natalie, life-affirming. In her most recent work, then, Smith is striving harder to encapsulate ordinary moments such as these, moments of self-recuperation that carry a broader social symbolism but that were presented with much greater ease in On Beauty, whose racially and socially diverse characters were filled with aesthetic experience all the time, it seems. This is hardly a flippant change of heart. It's a strident turn towards a grittier aesthetic, a flintier mode of observing different aspects of ethnic affiliation and intersubjectivity on the verge. The result in NW is a narrative economy in which the narrator no longer relies on the convenience of stylish aphorisms to reassure us that figures like Natalie will survive their personal and familial crises. Whatever beauty exists here is woven into the fabric of tragedy, as tender and exquisitely delineated snapshots of the physical world recur in situations of potential calamity. We can still see that Smith is capable of the kind of lyrical realism that she's both praised and criticised in the past, and Dave Gunning in his paper before lunch gave us a kind of a really fab commentary on the implications of this for thinking about Smith's movement between NW and from On Beauty to NW. But I think in her recent work, that lyricism has a fiercer edge now, momentary elegance surfacing in localised scenarios charged with fatality. Expressive though they undoubtedly are, her descriptions punctuate rather than transform fraught events, relinquishing any inclination to comfort us, as Smith accuses lyrical realism of doing, with its tendency to assure us of our beautiful plenitude. NW thus represents a break with Smith's earlier sensibilities. Gone is On Beauty's poised use of free indirect style, the controlled perspectivism that solicited from readers a feeling of counterintuitive sympathy toward the jaded adulterer Howard Belsey. Gone is the upbeat multicultural backdrop with white teeth, painting in the wake of happy hybridity a graver portrait of London's divisions. Gone are those descriptive ingredients that assure us of our beautiful plenitude, the ingredients Smith can muster well enough when she wants to. That NW is so undaunted in avoiding these traits makes it clear that Smith's mission is to slip the noose of classification and assume a temperament of her own making. What was beautiful about On Beauty's social vision has been translated here into something more rugged, yet just as compositionally beguiling, rougher in conception, but fiercely devoted to social particulars. A determination to flout what she calls the image of what you've been taught to value in fiction grants Smith the facility to offer her most uncompromising vision yet of race in contemporary Britain.